The West Texas sun beat down on the town of Redemption, baking the dirt into a cracked red canvas where shadows clung desperately to the undersides of rickety porches. Heat shimmered in waves from the ground, distorting the simple wooden facades of the general store and the saloon into wavering apparitions. It was a town gasping for breath, held captive by the oppressive silence of a Tuesday afternoon. Elias Carter felt the heat seep through the soles of his worn leather boots as he tied his horse, a sturdy bay named Atlas, to the hitching post outside Miller's Mercantile. The air smelled of creosote dry dust and the faint, sweet scent of aging pine from the boardwalks. Elias was a man carved from the same harsh landscape. His face was a map of sun-etched lines, his hair more salt than pepper, and his eyes, a piercing gray, held a stillness that spoke of storms weathered and tragedies endured. He moved with a deliberate economy of motion, a habit ingrained from years of solitude and a life that punished waste. He was in town for supplies, flour coffee cartridges for his Winchester, the simple necessities that marked the passing of weeks on his remote ranch. He nodded to Mrs. Miller, a woman whose kindness was as reliable as the rising sun, and was just turning to inspect a display of new saddle blankets when the world outside the store's dusty window exploded. Gunfire erupted, a sharp percussive crack that shattered the afternoon's lethargy. Glass from the bank across the street blew outward in a crystalline spray. People screamed. The placid tableau of Redemption dissolved into chaos as townsfolk dove for cover, their shouts swallowed by the continuing volley of shots. Elias reacted without thought, his body remembering drills from a lifetime ago. He dropped low, pulling Mrs. Miller down behind the sturdy oak counter, his hand instinctively going to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Through the broken storefront he saw them. 5 riders, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas. They moved with a chilling efficiency, a pack of wolves descending on unsuspecting sheep. 4 of them laid down a curtain of suppressing fire, their rifles spitting flame and lead into the air, while the 5th emerged from the bank, a heavy canvas sack slung over his shoulder. This one was different. He was taller, his movements more assured, and he wore his bandana lower, revealing a livid scar that cleaved its way from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline. The man radiated a cold, predatory authority. The town's sheriff, a young brave fool named Calloway, burst from his office, shotgun in hand. "Drop your weapons," he yelled, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and duty. The scarred man didn't even flinch. He raised his pistol in a smooth, unhurried motion and fired once. Sheriff Calloway crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his chest. A collective gasp rippled through the hidden townspeople. This wasn't just a robbery. It was a massacre in the making. As the gang prepared to mount their horses, a young woman no older than 20 stumbled out of the bank. Abigail Moore, the banker's daughter, her face pale with shock, her hands bound in front of her. The scarred man grabbed her by the arm, his grip ruthless, and hauled her toward his horse. She was their shield, their guarantee of a clean escape. "No," a voice cried out, the banker, Mr. Moore, running from the doorway, his face a mask of desperation. One of the riders backhanded him with a rifle butt, sending him sprawling into the dust. Elias watched his own breath caught in his throat, a cold fury building in his gut. He was a rancher now, a solitary man who had left the world of violence behind. But the soldier inside him, the man who had seen the worst of humanity and stood against it, was roaring back to life. He couldn't intervene, not against 5 rifles with a single pistol and a dozen innocent lives in the balance. The helplessness tasted like ash in his mouth. The scarred man threw the money sacks, and then the struggling Abigail across his saddle. As he swung himself up behind her, one of the smaller overstuffed bags caught on the saddle horn and ripped open. Coins and bills spilled into the street, but something else tumbled out, something that glinted silver in the harsh sunlight. It was a locket heart-shaped and intricately engraved with the image of a single blooming rose. It landed in the red dust, forgotten in the mayhem. The gang spurred their horses thundering out of town in a cloud of dust and chaos, leaving behind a dead sheriff, a broken banker, and a silence more profound than the one they had shattered. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly people began to emerge, their faces etched with horror. Elias remained crouched behind the counter, his gaze fixed on the spot in the street where the silver locket lay. The world seemed to narrow to that single point of light. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. He rose stiffly and walked out into the street, his boots crunching on shattered glass. He ignored the whispers, the cries of the wounded, the sight of Sheriff Calloway's body being gently covered with a blanket. He walked directly to the locket and knelt, his hand trembling as he reached for it. He picked it up. The silver was warm from the sun. He turned it over in his calloused palm, his thumb tracing the familiar pattern of the engraved rose. It was identical. Identical in every impossible detail to the locket he had commissioned from a silversmith in San Antonio more than a decade ago. The locket he had given to his wife Sarah on their first wedding anniversary. The locket she was wearing the night she died. A wave of cold dread washed over him, so intense it threatened to buckle his knees. It couldn't be. Sarah's locket had been lost in the fire, buried in the ashes of their home, along with all his hopes for the future. Yet here it was, dropped by a monster, with a familiar scar, a man who had just taken another innocent life. The quiet rancher who had ridden into Redemption for flour and coffee was gone. In his place stood a man with a ghost in his hand, and a cold, burning question in his soul. The past he had tried to bury had just ridden into his life on a stolen horse, and it was dragging him back into the darkness. The ranch was Elias's sanctuary, a fortress against the ghosts of his past. Tucked away in a shallow valley carved by a creek that ran dry most summers, the small sturdy cabin and barn were the only signs of human life for 20 miles. Here the world was reduced to the essentials, the groan of the windmill pulling water from the earth, the lowing of his small herd of cattle, the vast, indifferent expanse of the Texas sky. For 10 years this solitude had been his penance and his peace. Now it felt like a cage. In the days following the robbery and Redemption, Elias found no rest. The silver locket sat on the rough-hewn mantelpiece above his hearth, a constant, silent accusation. During the day, its polished surface caught the light, flashing reminders of a life he had lost. At night, it seemed to absorb the shadows, a repository of darkness. He would pick it up, the cool metal, a phantom touch against his skin, and the memories would come flooding back, sharp and unwelcome. His sleep was a battlefield. The nightmares, once dull and infrequent echoes, returned with a vengeance. He was back in the fire, the heat searing his lungs, the roar of the flames, a deafening beast. He saw Sarah's face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a scream that was always stolen by the inferno. He would reach for her, but his limbs felt heavy, useless, his hands closing on nothing but smoke and scorching air. And in the heart of the flames, he would see another face, younger, angrier, twisted in an agony that mirrored his own and the face of his brother Nathaniel. Then he would wake with a gasp, the smell of smoke phantom in his nostrils, his right hand, the one that bore a lattice of faint, silvery burn scars, clenched into a fist. The Carter tragedy, the old-timers in the sparse surrounding community still called it. A lamp knocked over. A fire that consumed a home, a wife, a brother, and a sister-in-law, with their infant child. Elias was the sole survivor, the man who had been out in the barn tending to a sick horse. He had tried to run back in, had fought the flames until his own clothes caught fire, and his neighbors dragged him away screaming his family's names. He had buried 4 empty coffins because there was nothing left to bury. The guilt was a brand on his soul. He had not been there to protect them. Now that carefully constructed narrative of his grief was fracturing. The locket was the first crack. The scar on the bank robber's face was the second. He remembered that scar, a foolish childhood accident with a hunting knife. He had been the one to stitch the wound on his younger brother's face, his hands clumsy but earnest. He had believed Nathaniel dead for 10 years, another victim of the fire. But the man who led the raid on Redemption wore his brother's scar. The man who had taken Abigail Moore hostage was a ghost from his own personal hell. He spent his days in a fugue of restless energy, mending fences that didn't need mending, cleaning a rifle that was already pristine. The simple, grounding rhythm of ranch life could no longer soothe him. He was waiting. He didn't know for what, but a deep, primal instinct told him that the storm that had passed through Redemption was heading his way. 3 days after the robbery had arrived, he was drawing water from the well at dusk when he saw it. A figure stumbling across the open plain to the east, a small dark shape against the bruised purple of the horizon. It was too small to be a rider, its movements too erratic. As it drew closer, he saw it was a woman. She was limping, her clothes torn to rags, her hair a matted tangle. She would take a few desperate steps, then sway, then push herself forward again, with sheer, ragged determination. Elias grabbed his rifle from its place by the door and moved cautiously to intercept her, his eyes scanning the surrounding hills for any sign of pursuit. The woman saw him, and her pace faltered. She raised a hand, as if to ward him off, then her legs gave out, and she collapsed in a heap on the sun-scorched earth. He reached her in a dozen long strides. It was the banker's daughter, Abigail Moore. Her face was scratched and bruised, her lips cracked and swollen from dehydration. The ropes had left angry, raw welts on her wrists. But her eyes, when they fluttered open, were not broken. They were filled with a fierce, defiant fire. "Water," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. He uncorked his canteen and gently lifted her head, letting her take small, careful sips. She drank like a woman dying of thirst, which she very nearly was. After a moment, she pushed the canteen away, her breathing still labored. "He's hunting me," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "The man, the one with the scar. We escaped, my friend Clara and I, but we got separated. He'll be looking for me." Elias's blood ran cold. "You escaped from him?" She nodded, a tremor running through her exhausted body. "They weren't just bank robbers. They were slavers, taking us to the mining camps south of the border." Her gaze fell upon his cabin, the barn, the quiet solitude of the place. "Am I safe here?" The question hung in the air between them. He could tell her to keep moving, to take her trouble elsewhere. It was the smart thing to do, the only way to preserve the fragile peace he had built. But then his eyes fell on the raw wounds on her wrists, and he saw the ghost of his own helplessness in the face of unstoppable violence. He looked from her determined, terrified face back toward his cabin, where Sarah's locket lay on the mantel. This girl was not just a stranger seeking refuge. She was a link, a living, breathing clue to the mystery that was tearing his world apart. He was searching for something, Abigail whispered, her eyes clouding with a confused memory. "He kept asking me about it. After the robbery, he was furious. Said something important was lost." She struggled to sit up, her focus sharpening. A locket. He was looking for a matching locket. He said his was useless without its partner. The world tilted on its axis. A matching locket. Elias felt the air leave his lungs. He had commissioned 2, identical in every way, save for a tiny, almost invisible inscription of their initials he'd had the silversmith add inside. One for Sarah and one for Nathaniel's wife, Eleanor, as a wedding gift. Nathaniel was alive, and he was searching for his wife's locket, which meant he believed Elias had it. The storm had not just arrived. It had made landfall in his front yard. Elias looked down at the young woman who had brought it to him. Helping her was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. His quest for redemption had just been given a name, and it was Abigail Moore. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a low growl of conviction that surprised even himself. He scooped her up in his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed. "For now. Get some rest. We have a fight on our hands." As he carried her toward the cabin, he knew his decade of peace was over. The ghosts of the Carter tragedy were no longer content to haunt his dreams. They were coming for him, and they were armed. The scent of brewing coffee and frying bacon filled the small cabin, a starkly domestic aroma that felt alien in the charged atmosphere. Elias had tended to Abigail's wounds the night before, cleaning the cuts and applying a soothing salve with surprisingly gentle hands. He had given her a spare shirt and trousers, and she had fallen into an exhausted sleep by the hearth, a spare blanket pulled up to her chin. Now, as the morning sun streamed through the cabin's single window, she sat at his small wooden table watching him. She moved stiffly, her body a tapestry of aches and bruises, but the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a watchful curiosity. She was studying him, trying to reconcile the gentle caretaker with the grim, formidable man who had carried her from the brink of death. "You're not just a rancher, are you?" she asked, her voice stronger now. Elias placed a plate of bacon and biscuits in front of her without meeting her eyes. "Used to be a lot of things. Rancher is what's left." The laconic reply did little to satisfy her. "The men who took me, they're animals. But their leader, the one with the scar, he's different. Colder. Smarter. He's not just in it for the money." Elias finally looked at her, his gray eyes hard as granite. "What makes you say that?" "The way he talks," she said, picking at a biscuit. "He quotes books. He spoke about Greek tragedies, about brothers cursed by fate. He's educated, and he's driven by something more than greed. It's a rage, a deep, burning rage." The description sent a chill down Elias's spine. That was his brother. The boy who had devoured every book he could get his hands on, who had dreamed of being a professor or a lawyer, not a rancher. The fire had burned away the scholar and left behind only the rage. Before he could respond, a sound from outside cut through the morning air. It wasn't the familiar nicker of his horse or the lowing of cattle. It was the sharp snap of a dry twig under a heavy boot. Instantly, the quiet rancher vanished. In his place was the soldier. Elias moved with a fluid, silent grace that belied his age. He held a finger to his lips, signaling for Abigail to stay down, and grabbed the Winchester from its pegs on the wall. He crept to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. A man was making his way toward the cabin from the east, moving in a low crouch. He was lean and wiry, with the patient, predatory movements of a hunter. A tracker. He held a rifle at the ready, his eyes scanning the area, missing nothing. He must have followed Abigail's trail. "Stay here, and stay quiet," Elias whispered, his voice deadly calm. He slipped out the back door, as silently as a shadow circling around the small woodpile. Abigail crouched by the window, her heart pounding against her ribs. She watched the tracker draw closer to the cabin, his confidence growing, as he found no sign of alarm. He was 20 yards from the front door when Elias stepped out from behind the corner of the barn. "That's far enough," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the air with absolute authority. The tracker spun around, surprise flashing across his face, and started to bring his rifle up. He never had the chance. Elias's Winchester was already shouldered, aimed, and steady. The metallic click of the hammer being cocked was the loudest sound in the valley. "Drop it," Elias commanded. The tracker hesitated, his eyes flicking from Elias to the cabin and back again. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He was weighing his options, calculating his chances. He made the wrong calculation. He lunged to the side, trying to bring his rifle to bear as he sought cover. Elias fired. He didn't aim for the chest or the head. The shot was precise, clinical. It struck the tracker in the thigh. The man screamed a high, thin sound of pain and collapsed, his rifle clattering in the dirt. Elias strode forward, Winchester still trained on the man's chest. He kicked the discarded rifle away and knelt beside the writhing tracker. "Who sent you, Elias?" demanded his voice, devoid of emotion. The tracker spat a mouthful of dirt and blood. "Go to hell." Elias pressed the barrel of the Winchester against the man's good leg. "I've been there. It's hot. Now you can tell me what I want to know, or you can learn to walk on two stumps. Your choice." The man's bravado evaporated, replaced by raw fear. "Nathaniel," he gasped. "Nathaniel sent me to find the girl and bring her back." "How many more are with him?" "4. The rest of the crew. They're camped in the canyons to the south, waiting for my signal." Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He ripped a strip of cloth from the tracker's own shirt and fashioned a crude tourniquet around the wound, pulling it brutally tight. The man cried out again. "That'll keep you from bleeding out before the buzzards find you," Elias said coldly. He stood and retrieved a coil of rope from the barn. He bound the man's hands and feet with swift, efficient knots, then dragged him into the shade of the barn, out of sight. He walked back into the cabin. Abigail stared at him, her eyes wide. She had seen him as a protector, a kind stranger. Now she saw something else, a man capable of calculated lethal violence. He had dispatched the threat with the chilling efficiency of a wolf culling a rival from the pack. The realization wasn't entirely frightening. In a world that had shown her only weakness and cruelty, his dangerous competence was a strange and powerful comfort. "He said his name is Nathaniel." She said, her voice barely a whisper. Elias looked at her, his face a grim mask. The time for secrets was over. "Nathaniel Carter," he said, the name tasting like rust in his mouth. "He's my brother." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and unbelievable. Abigail's mouth fell open, her mind struggling to connect the ruthless monster who had captured her with the stoic man who had just saved her. "We can't stay here." Elias continued, already moving about the cabin gathering supplies. "He knows she came this way. When his man doesn't return, he'll come looking himself. We need to move, and we need answers." His plan was already forming. They couldn't outrun Nathaniel's gang, not with a day's head start. But they could outthink them. They had to get ahead of him to find out what he was truly after. There was a town, a small, dusty mining outpost called Prospect, about 2 days' ride north. It was a haven for drifters, prospectors, and men on the run, the kind of place where information was a currency. And a man like Nathaniel might have contacts. "Pack what you can carry," he told Abigail. "We ride in 10 minutes. She didn't question him. She simply nodded and began to gather what little she had. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was a target. Their journey had begun a desperate flight that was quickly becoming a hunt. They were two resilient souls bound by a shared enemy, heading into the heart of the unforgiving wilderness to confront a ghost from the past. The Texas landscape unfurled before them, a vast and brutal tapestry of rock, sand, and thorny scrub. They rode north, Elias leading on Atlas, with Abigail following on his gentler mare Willow. They kept to the low ground, following dry creek beds and weaving through copses of mesquite to stay off the skyline. Elias moved with a purpose that Abigail found reassuring. His eyes constantly scanning, reading the land like a book he had known his whole life. The silence between them was not awkward, but companionable. It was filled with the rhythmic creak of saddle leather, the soft thud of hooves on packed earth, and the whisper of the wind through the brittle grass. In the crucible of their shared danger, a bond was being forged. It wasn't built on pretty words, but on small gestures, the way he'd pass her the canteen without being asked, or the way she'd take the watch for a few hours while he rested her hand, never far from the small pistol he had given her. "Tell me about him," she said one evening as they sat by a small smokeless fire hidden in the embrace of a rocky overhang. "About Nathaniel." Elias stared into the flames, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had not spoken his brother's name to another soul in 10 years. Saying it now felt like breaking open a sealed tomb. He was bright. Elias began, his voice raspy. Always had his nose in a book. He talked about the world beyond these plains. He wanted to be a teacher, see the great cities of the East. He paused, a flicker of a sad smile touching his lips. I was the one who was meant for this life. The dirt, the cattle. He was meant for more. I was proud of him. He fell silent, the memories pulling him back. Abigail waited patiently, understanding that these were words being excavated from a place of deep pain. We married sisters, Elias continued softly. Sarah and Eleanor. They were as close as he and I were. For a while, for a little while, everything was perfect. We had the ranch family. It was all a man could ask for. His voice hardened, the warmth seeping out of it. But the land is hard. There were droughts, bad winters. Nathaniel grew impatient. He started talking about faster ways to make money, about men he'd met who didn't play by the rules. He had a darkness in him, a resentment that the world hadn't just handed him the life he thought he deserved. The fire crackled, spitting an ember into the darkness. Elias's gaze was distant, lost in the inferno of his memory. Then came the fire. He didn't need to elaborate. The tremor in his hand, the way he flinched from the heat of their small campfire, told the story better than words could. I was told he died. That they all died. For 10 years I mourned a brother. Now I find out I was mourning a memory. The man he became. That's a stranger to me. His confession left a profound stillness in its wake. Abigail felt a surge of empathy for this guarded, wounded man. He was not just fighting an outlaw. He was fighting the ghost of the brother he loved, a ghost that had returned as a monster. She in turn told him of her life before the abduction, of her father's bank, of her plans to travel to Austin to study music, of a life of quiet promise that had been shattered in an instant. They were two people from different worlds, and their lives irrevocably smashed together by the same violent force. In sharing their broken pieces, they found a strange sort of wholeness. On the second day, they reached Prospect. It was less a town and more a scar on the landscape, a chaotic collection of tents, lean-tos, and a few ramshackle wooden buildings huddled around a muddy street. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap whiskey, and desperation. Men with hard eyes and guns on their hips watched them ride in their gazes, lingering on Abigail. Elias kept his hand resting casually on his Colt, his expression a clear warning. He led them to the livery run by a one-eyed man named Silas, an old army acquaintance. Carter's Silas grunted, his good eye widening in surprise. Thought you were dead or planted. Just planted, Silas. Elias replied dryly. I'm looking for information. A man leading a crew, tall with a scar on his face, calls himself Nathaniel. Silas spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. Heard of him. They call his outfit the Scholars on account of their leaders spouting poetry while he's taking your gold. He passed through here a week or so ago. Met with a man named Jedediah Kane, a land agent for the Trans-Pecos Railroad. The information landed like a stone in Elias's gut. The railroad, a massive hungry entity that devoured land and crushed anyone who stood in its way. What business would a petty outlaw have with a powerful railroad agent? Where can I find this Kane? Elias asked. He keeps a room at the saloon. But be careful, Carter. Kane's got the railroad's money and their muscle. He's not a man to be trifled with. Leaving Abigail with a stern warning to stay put and keep the pistol handy, Elias crossed the street to the saloon. The place was a den of noise and smoke. He found Jedediah Kane in a back corner, a portly man in a sweat-stained suit playing poker with a pair of hired guns. Elias approached the table. Mr. Kane, a word. Cain looked up annoyed. I'm busy. Whatever you're selling, I'm not buying. Elias leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. I'm not selling. I'm asking. About Nathaniel Carter. Cain's composure cracked. A flicker of fear crossed his face before he masked it with a sneer. Never heard of him. Elias's hand shot out and clamped down on Cain's wrist, his grip like iron. My brother has a habit of collecting things that don't belong to him. I have a feeling you know something about it. Now you can talk to me here, or we can step outside and you can explain it to my friends Smith and Wesson. The hired guns started to rise, but Elias's cold gray eyes promised a violence they weren't being paid enough to face. Cain paled, nodding frantically. All right, outside. Elias dragged him out into an alley behind the saloon, the stench of stale beer and refuse thick in the air. He slammed the bigger man against the wall. Talk, Elias commanded. Carter was hired by the railroad. Cain blurted out, his voice shaking. Years ago. To persuade landowners who wouldn't sell. He was good at it. Fires, accidents. He made problems disappear. The world spun around Elias. He felt the blood drain from his face. Fires, accidents. My ranch, Elias whispered, the horrifying realization dawning on him. The fire at my ranch. Cain nodded, his eyes squeezed shut. The Carter homestead was prime land. A river running through it. The railroad wanted it for a water stop. Your family wouldn't sell. Nathaniel. He was supposed to just scare you. Set a fire in the barn. But something went wrong. The wind shifted. The house went up too fast. The truth was a physical blow, knocking the air from Elias's lungs. The fire hadn't been an accident. It was arson, an attack. And his own brother had been the one holding the torch. Nathaniel hadn't just survived the fire. He had started it. The tragedy that had defined Elias's life, the guilt that had eaten away at his soul for a decade, was a lie. It wasn't a random act of fate. It was a betrayal of the deepest, most monstrous kind. The quest for answers was over. A hunt had begun. A hunt for a brother who had not only become a monster, but who had been one all along. As he stood in that filthy alley, the world of quiet grief he had built for himself burned to the ground for a second time. This time all that rose from the ashes was a cold, pure, and righteous rage. The revelation in prospect ignited a fire in Elias that burned hotter than any memory. The weight of his guilt was gone, replaced by the crushing burden of a decade-long deception. He now understood the source of Nathaniel's twisted rage. It was the self-loathing of a man who had murdered his own family and projected the blame onto the world. He and Abigail left Prospect at dawn, their mission transformed. They were no longer running. They were closing a circle. Elias's intimate knowledge of the land became their greatest weapon. He knew the hidden trails, the secret springs, the shortcuts his brother would never anticipate. He pushed them hard, his face set in a grim, determined mask. As they rode, news of Nathaniel's gang reached them like smoke on the wind. They heard it from a traveling preacher, then from a group of cowboys on a cattle drive. Nathaniel Carter, aware that Elias was alive and pursuing him, had become bolder, more reckless. His rage was no longer contained. He was lashing out, and his target was redemption. The news came from a panicked farmer fleeing the town. He's taken the town hostage, the man cried, his eyes wild with fear. The man with the scar, he rode in with his gang and just took it. He's got old man Hemlock, the store owner, tied to the porch of the bank. Says he's waiting for someone. Says he's come to settle a family debt. Elias's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle jumped. This was Nathaniel's move, a gambit born of arrogance and desperation. He was turning redemption into a stage for their final confrontation, using innocent lives as pawns in his twisted play. He was forcing Elias's hand, drawing him out into the open. We have to go back, Abigail said, her voice firm. There was no trace of the frightened girl who had stumbled onto his ranch. In her place was a woman of quiet, steely resolve. We can't let him hurt those people. Elias looked at her, seeing for the first time not just a person he was protecting, but a partner. He's expecting me to ride straight in. It's a trap. Then we don't spring it, she replied, her mind working quickly. You know this land better than him. There has to be another way into town, a way he won't be watching. She was right. There was an old, overgrown arroyo that ran along the southern edge of town, ending behind the blacksmith's forge. It was a difficult, treacherous path, but it would put them in the heart of redemption unseen. They arrived at the outskirts of town as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and crimson. The place was eerily silent. Nathaniel's men were positioned on the rooftops, their rifles glinting in the dying light. In the center of the street, tied to a chair in front of the bank, sat Mr. Hemlock, a kind, elderly man who had given Elias candy as a boy. And on the bank's porch, standing like a king surveying his domain, was Nathaniel. He saw them the moment they rode into view on the main road, just as he'd intended. Brother Nathaniel's voice boomed across the empty street, laced with a theatrical mocking tone. I knew you couldn't resist a family reunion. Did you enjoy your decade of peace, living on the land you stole from me? Townsfolk peeked from behind their curtains, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Brother. The word rippled through the hidden audience. They saw Elias, the quiet, solitary rancher, and the monster holding them captive, and were told they were kin. Doubt began to poison their minds. Was Elias somehow responsible for this terror? Let Hemlock go, Nathaniel Elias called back, his voice steady and cold. This is between you and me. Oh, it is. Nathaniel laughed, a chilling, mirthless sound. But every play needs an audience. And these good people are about to witness the final act of the Carter tragedy. The act where the guilty brother finally pays for his sins. It was the opening Elias needed. While all eyes, including Nathaniel's, were locked on him at the north end of town, Abigail was already gone. She had slipped away minutes before, circling around to the south, making her way down into the overgrown arroyo with a small pistol and a grim determination. Elias held his brother's attention, their voices carrying in a tense public duel of accusations. He dismounted slowly, standing exposed in the middle of the street. It was a calculated risk, a display of confidence designed to keep Nathaniel focused entirely on him. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the street into long, deep shadows. Just as Nathaniel was growing impatient, a commotion erupted from behind the blacksmith's forge. A plume of thick black smoke began to billow into the sky. Abigail had set fire to a pile of old oil-soaked rags in the forge's scrap heap. The rooftop guards spun around, distracted by the sudden blaze. Nathaniel himself turned, his brow furrowing in confusion. In that single critical moment of distraction, Elias moved. He wasn't aiming for his brother. He was aiming for the rope holding Mr. Hemlock. His Colt Peacemaker bucked in his hand, and the shot echoing like a thunderclap. The bullet shredded the rope, and the old man, freed, scrambled for cover. Chaos erupted. The rooftop guards, realizing their mistake, turned their rifles back toward Elias. A second shot rang out, this one from the shadows near the forge. One of the guards cried out and tumbled from the roof. Abigail. The fight was on. Gunfire shattered the twilight as Elias dove behind a water trough, returning fire with methodical precision. He was no longer just a rancher. He was the soldier he had once been, a man of purpose and deadly skill, fighting not for a flag, but for the soul of a town, and the chance to confront the demon who wore his brother's face. The dust storm hit without warning. One moment the sky was a canvas of twilight purple. The next, the horizon dissolved into a roiling brown wall that swept across the plains with the speed of a freight train. It descended on the burned-out ruins of the Carter homestead, a place of ghosts and ash, turning the world into a maelstrom of howling wind and stinging sand. This was where it had to end. After the firefight in Redemption, Nathaniel and his remaining men had fled with Elias and Abigail in close pursuit. Elias knew where his brother was going. He was being drawn back to the site of his original sin, the epicenter of their shared tragedy. Now, within the skeletal remains of the house where they were born, the two brothers faced each other. The wind shrieked through the charred timbers like a chorus of the damned. Visibility was near zero, the air so thick with dust that every breath was a struggle. Abigail was nearby, taking cover behind the crumbling stone chimney, her pistol clutched in her hands. "You should have died in that fire." Nathaniel screamed, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the storm. He was a silhouette in the swirling chaos, a phantom of rage. It was your fault, always yours. It was your fire. Nathaniel Elias's voice cut through the gale, cold and steady. "The railroad. Jedediah Kane told me everything. You were hired to burn us out." A flicker of shock crossed Nathaniel's face, visible for a brief second as the dust parted. "Lies. You left us to die. I saw you in the barn. You just stood there while Eleanor and my son burned, while Sarah screamed your name." His words were a gut punch. Elias staggered back, the accusation hitting him with the force of a physical blow. That was Nathaniel's truth. That was the lie he had built his entire life upon. In his grief-stricken mind, he had twisted Elias's helpless horror into a deliberate act of cowardice. He believed Elias had abandoned them. "I tried to get back in." Elias yelled back, the words torn from his throat. "The roof collapsed. I tried." "Liar," Nathaniel shrieked, and he lunged forward, not with a gun, but with a knife, a wild, desperate attack. The two brothers collided, a tangle of limbs and fury in the blinding dust. It was a primal, brutal fight. They crashed through the rotten floorboards into the shallow, ash-filled cellar below. The storm raged above them, their world reduced to a suffocating pit of darkness and memory. It was in that moment of chaos that Abigail made her move. She had been doing more than just surviving. She had been observing. During her captivity, she'd noticed a small, unique brand on the gang's horses, a circle bisected by a jagged line, like a bolt of lightning. In Prospect, while Elias confronted Kane, she had seen that same symbol embossed on a leather satchel in the railroad agent's office. And now she saw it again, carved into the hilt of the very knife Nathaniel was trying to plunge into his brother's chest. "It's the railroad's mark," she screamed, her voice piercing the roar of the wind as she scrambled to the edge of the hole. "Nathaniel, look at your knife. That symbol. It belongs to the Trans-Pecos Railroad. Kane's men use it. They branded you like cattle." Nathaniel froze, his arm raised for a killing blow. He looked down at the knife in his hand, then back up, his eyes wild with confusion. The symbol. He had been given the knife by the man who hired him all those years ago. A gift for his service. He had never questioned it. The truth, when it finally broke through his wall of rage, shattered him. It wasn't Elias. It was never Elias. He had been a pawn, a disposable tool for a faceless railroad baron who wanted his family's land. His entire vendetta, the fuel for a decade of hatred, was a lie. The fire that took his family was not his brother's fault, but his own, instigated by men who saw him as nothing more than an asset to be managed. A pained, guttural sob escaped his lips. The fight went out of him. He dropped the knife, his body slumping in defeat. And then new shapes emerged from the swirling dust at the edge of the cellar. 4 of them. Hard-faced men in long dusters, their rifles leveled. They were not from Nathaniel's gang. Their leader, a man with eyes as dead as a snake's, smiled grimly. "Mr. Kane sends his regards," the man said, his voice flat. "The railroad has a policy about loose ends. They had been tracking Nathaniel all along, sent to silence the one man who could tie them to the Carter fire. Now they had found him, along with 2 other witnesses." The lead gunman aimed his rifle at Elias. Time seemed to slow down. Abigail cried out, but before the man could pull the trigger, Nathaniel moved. With the last ounce of his strength fueled by a final desperate surge of brotherly love, he threw himself in front of Elias. The rifle cracked, and the bullet intended for Elias slammed into Nathaniel's chest. He grunted, a look of profound surprise on his face, and collapsed into his brother's arms. The chaotic aftermath had begun. The crack of the rifle shot was swallowed by the howling wind, but its effect was absolute. As Nathaniel crumpled, the spell of inaction broke. Elias, his brother's weight a sudden tragic burden in his arms, reacted on pure instinct. He rolled, pulling them both deeper into the shadows of the cellar, as the Baron's men opened fire, splintering the charred wood around them. Abigail didn't hesitate. From her position at the chimney, she fired her small pistol, the sound a sharp pop against the roar of the storm and the thunder of rifles. Her shot was a desperate gamble, but it found its mark, striking one of the gunmen in the shoulder and sending him staggering back with a curse. The distraction was all Elias needed. He laid Nathaniel gently on the ashen floor and came up firing his Colt. The confined space of the cellar amplified the roar of the peacemaker. One gunman fell, then another. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. The remaining two killers, realizing they had underestimated their prey, broke and fled back into the blinding fury of the dust storm, swallowed by the chaos they had emerged from. Silence descended, broken only by the mournful wind and Nathaniel's ragged, shallow breaths. Elias crawled to his brother's side, pressing his hand against the wound in his chest. It was useless. The blood pumped weakly between his fingers. "Elias," Nathaniel whispered, his eyes cleared of their manic rage, finding his brother's. There was no hatred left in them, only a profound, heartbreaking regret. Eleanor. She knew. She told me to walk away. From the railroad men. I didn't listen. A single tear cut a clean path through the grime on his cheek. "I'm sorry," he gasped, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry." His hand reached up, clutching Elias's shirt for a moment, a final desperate connection. Then his eyes went vacant, and the last breath sighed out of him. Nathaniel Carter was dead, finding in his last moments a sliver of the redemption he had so long denied himself. Elias stayed there for a long time, cradling his brother's body. As the dust storm raged around them, the wind a fitting eulogy for a life consumed by a storm of its own making. Abigail eventually came to his side, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, a silent, steady presence in his all-consuming grief. They buried him there on the land he was born, on the land he had destroyed and died to protect. They used a piece of scorched timber as a grave marker. There were no prayers said. The silence was more fitting. The journey back to Elias's ranch was a somber, wordless affair. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, and the sky a brilliant, aching blue. When they arrived, the place felt different. It was no longer a refuge from the past, but a place to build a future. They tended to their wounds, the cuts and bruises, a physical manifestation of the deeper scars within. A week later, the new sheriff of Redemption, a stern but fair man named Davis, rode out to the ranch. He brought with him two of the men from Nathaniel's former gang captured after the fight. Under questioning, they had corroborated the entire story of the railroad's involvement. Armed with their testimony and a statement from Elias Sheriff Davis, formed a posse which included a U.S. Marshal who had been tracking the Trans-Pecos Railroad's illicit activities for months. Justice, it seemed, was finally on its way. Elias and Abigail settled into a quiet rhythm. The work of the ranch was healing its simple, honest demands, grounding them in the present. The bond that had been forged in fire and fear began to transform, blossoming into something deeper, quieter, and more profound. It was an unspoken understanding, a shared solace in the wake of the storm. Months passed. The relentless heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. Life on the ranch found its steady, peaceful rhythm. The windmill turned, the cattle grew fat on the late-season grass, and the small cabin, once a bastion of solitary grief, now echoed with the quiet sounds of two people building a life together. Abigail had chosen to stay. Her dreams of studying music in Austin had been replaced by a new, more tangible reality, one she found she would not trade for anything. News from the outside world arrived infrequently, carried by the mail rider or a passing traveler. The railroad baron, a powerful man named Corbin Hayes, had been arrested. His empire of corruption, built on intimidation and murder, had been brought down by the testimony of outlaws and the quiet determination of a single rancher. The town of Redemption was healing its people, no longer whispering about the Carter tragedy, but speaking with respect of the man who had faced down his own ghosts to save them. One afternoon, Sheriff Davis made the long ride out to the ranch one last time. He carried a small, worn leather satchel. "These were recovered from your brother's effects," he said, handing it to Elias. "Thought you should have them." Elias took the satchel inside a knot, tightening in his stomach. He and Abigail sat at the table as he unfastened the buckle. Inside were a few personal items, a worn copy of Plato's Republic, a tarnished silver dollar, and a small folded bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Elias carefully unwrapped it. They were letters. The paper was brittle and singed at the edges, the ink faded but still legible. They were from Eleanor, Nathaniel's wife, written in the weeks leading up to the fire. As Elias read them aloud, his voice thick with emotion, the final missing pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. Eleanor had known about the railroad's threats. She had pleaded with Nathaniel to take their family and leave, to abandon the land and the life he was so desperately trying to improve through his dangerous dealings. The final letter, dated the day before the fire, revealed her desperate plan. "If you will not come with me, Nathaniel," she had written, "then I must go without you. Sarah has agreed. She sees the danger too. We will take the children and go to her cousins in San Antonio until you see reason. We will be gone by morning. I pray you will follow." Elias stopped reading the letter, trembling in his hand. Sarah. His Sarah had known. She hadn't been a passive victim of the fire. She had been preparing to flee it, to protect her family. He had carried a sliver of guilt that he had not seen the danger, that he hadn't been able to protect her. This final charred message from the past absolved him completely. She had been as strong and perceptive as he remembered. Her last act was one of courage. The revelation settled a profound peace over him, a sense of closure that had eluded him for more than a decade. The ghosts were finally truly at rest. Later that evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, Elias stood before the hearth. Abigail came and stood beside him, her presence a warm, solid comfort. He picked up the silver locket from the mantelpiece, Sarah's locket, the catalyst for his long, painful journey back to the world. He held it in his palm, the engraved rose, a final, beautiful memory of a love that had shaped him. He had carried his grief like a heavy cloak for 10 years. Now it was time to lay it down. He did not put it away in a drawer to be forgotten. Instead, with a sense of quiet reverence, he placed it back on the mantelpiece, not as a shrine to a painful past, but as a cherished part of the story that had led him here, to this moment, to this new life with Abigail. He had made peace with his ghosts. He was no longer a man defined by what he had lost, but by what he had fought to protect and what he was now ready to build. He turned from the hearth, away from the shadows of the past, and looked at Abigail, her face illuminated by the warm lamplight. In her eyes, he saw not a reflection of his sorrow, but the bright, clear promise of a future.